Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for coming back to this week's show. Hope you are staying curiouser and curiouser out there. Now, this week's show is a special show, one that uh, every podcast that I've ever had, I always dedicate the week of November 11th to the International and National Maritime Memorial for Lives Lost due to maritime accidents, um, whether it's drownings, shipwrecks, um, I don't want to say shark attacks, but we'll just say non-human attacks that end in human loss of life. Um, this is, a week that's very special to me because I do a lot of presentations, a lot of research, and a lot of lectures on the paranormal history of the Great Lakes, which includes shipwrecks and ghost ships and haunted lighthouses and ghosts of the Great Lakes. And I think it's only fitting that I dedicate a episode of whatever podcast I'm doing to this day of remembrance, because it's what I research, it's what I have a interest in. Now, the reason that they chose November 11th was because between November 10th and November 11th was when the Edmund Fitzgerald sank on Lake Superior, 18 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. Now, the Edmund Fitzgerald was a notable ship. She was the Queen of the Lakes during her reign. She was the pride of the American side. All these expressions and nicknames for her. But most people would not know her as well as they do now if it wasn't for the Gordon Lightfoot song. And we have to give praise to Gordon Lightfoot for feeling so moved by the tragedy of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald that he wrote that song, added music to it, and it's become one of the most recognizable songs that people just instantly know. And it's all because of the way that the Edmund Fitzgerald sank. Because the Anderson was only a half mile behind her. And when you're out on Lake Superior, you can see lights for a long distance. So the Edmund Fitzgerald, before she sank, had lost her radar. She was being beaten by a huge storm, or gale, as we call them here in the Great Lakes area, that was just sweeping across Lake Superior. And she was not faring well, which is scary when you think that the Edmund Fitzgerald was in her prime. She was a good ship with a good crew, and Captain McSorley, who was piloting her, was one of the best boat captains on the Great Lakes, who knew his ship. And the last transmission that was ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald was this exact phrase: "We're holding our own." And then she was gone. Now, my theory is that as the Edmund Fitzgerald was sinking underwater with her engine still going at full power, which meant her propellers were going at full power, full speed. When she struck the bottom of the lake and drove a trough through the bottom of the lake and broke in two, and the last of her lights in her interior went out, and her crew were lost forever. The Anderson was just going overhead. Now, it's at this point that the captain of the Anderson realizes something's wrong, because the Edmund Fitzgerald is not showing up on their radar. They radio to the Coast Guard, and this is a bad storm. This is one of the major storms that they've had on one of the Great Lakes. And the Coast Guard asked the captain of the Anderson to circle back around and look for wreckage, which he was very apprehensive of doing, because if this storm took the Edmund Fitzgerald underneath the waves, how was he to know that it wouldn't take the Anderson also? So they did as they were asked. They circled back around to the last pinpointed coordinates that they had for the Edmund Fitzgerald, and she was gone. They couldn't find any wreckage at that time, and it wouldn't be until a underwater salvage company and submersible crew and divers went down and found the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald that even the bell would be brought up. And when a documentary film crew went down and were documenting the Edmund Fitzgerald. Now, the Edmund Fitzgerald, even though she was the pride of the American side, she actually sank in Canadian waters. Lake Superior is a huge lake. It's an inland sea. But because it's so huge, and half of it is bordered by Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the other half is bordered by the Canadian province of Ontario. So Lake Superior's divided up. Part of it's American waters, part of it's Canadian waters. The Edmund Fitzgerald sits in Canadian waters. That's where she sank. And when this documentary film crew went down, Rick Mixer, who is a shipwreck researcher and enthusiast, he keeps their stories alive, just like I try to do, paying honor to the crews, the ship itself, so that they're not lost to history. Because we certainly know that the Great Lakes have taken their fair of ships that will probably never be found, but we do know where the Edmund Fitzgerald is. But when this documentary film crew went down in a submersible, it was their last dive on the wreck. And as they were touring around the outer edges of the walls of the ship, their headlights shone down upon human remains, which instantly made the Edmund Fitzgerald a marine burial ground, underwater graveyard, the final resting place of the Edmund Fitzgerald's crew. Now, knowing that there's human remains down there alongside the ship, this changes how people are allowed to interact with the ship. So you're no longer allowed to just dive on the Edmund Fitzgerald. One, it's a technical dive. It's over 150 feet deep. So that means you have to be in a submersible. And there are sensors all around the Edmund Fitzgerald so that if you do enter into the waters, the Coast Guard is alerted immediately so that nobody is stealing artifacts off of this ship. Now, some people ask, well, why didn't they bring up the human remains from the ship? And that's because that is a huge no-no in maritime traditions. Generally, when the crew and the captain go down with the ship, that's their final resting place. That is their cemetery, their graveyard, their burial. And a lot of times the families say, we want them left where they are, because that is their final resting place. And so when you're on the Great Lakes, or when you're on any body of water and you see a shipwreck, or you're a diver and you're diving or scuba diving on these wrecks, keep in mind that if you don't know the exact history of that ship and its sinking, that you could very well be diving on a ship that is the final resting place of the captain or the crew. And just keep that in mind. Be respectful. Now, a lot of boats, ships on the Great Lakes had lifeboats or life rafts, but they weren't always that stable. So chances on the Great Lakes, a lot of times they were wearing wool clothing. Now, wool is heavy when it's dry. When wool gets wet, it's that much heavier. And when you're in icy, frigid waters and you're soaked to the bone and your lifeboat keeps getting overturned by the harsh waves that are striking it, eventually your clothes become so heavy that either you take them off and you possibly freeze to death or die of hypothermia, or when you get knocked out of the boat the next time, your clothing is so heavy that it just pulls you underneath the water. And this is a fate that a lot of maritime sailors and captains knew. But unfortunately, most of the people who are trapped inside the ships when they sink, unfortunately, are the cooks. Because the cooks are in the galley trying to keep everything from flying off the shelves. They might be cooking dinner or a lunch or a breakfast at that point. They are trying to keep the coffee going so that the crew at least has something hot to put into their bodies as they are battling through a storm or a gale. And so as the cooks are trying to do their due diligence in providing for the captains and the crew, oftentimes they are the last crew member to be thought of when the ship is sinking and notified that it's time to abandon ship. So a lot of times it's the cooks and the captains who go down with the ships. Now, there is a saying here in the Great Lakes area about the Witch of November and how she'll come early, which can be in October through November into December. But this is where we get these gale force storms. And they are nothing to be joked about. They are catastrophes, just as bad as any hurricane or tornado that anybody in North America experiences. So if you're in the Great Lakes area, I request of you, look up shipwrecks in the Great Lakes area and find out more about them. Edmund Fitzgerald is just one of 20,000 shipwrecks here in the Great Lakes. So until next week, stay curious out there